Super happy to have you here today, Sara Vero. Where are you hailing from? Let us know here.
I'm from Ireland, so I'm here in County Wexford, which is on the south coast of Ireland.
Hmm.
We call it the sunny southeast, but it's not
Okay.
sunny really by any other country standards.
I
Just
love it.
less rainy.
Let's rainy. Okay, okay. I love it. I love it. I really love the Irish accent. And anyway, I just wanted to say it because it's a personal thing. I love languages in general. I think accents are a beautiful thing, and I
I
really like
agree,
the
totally.
the musicality to your accent. And I know that even in Ireland there's different flavors, right?
Yeah, even for such a small country, you can really identify even down to the county, or even down to even smaller than that, the region someone's
Wow.
from. There's the huge diversity in accents. At least once you have your ear tuned in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the time that you're giving to be on Papa PhD today. I'm super happy that you reached out. I think we're gonna have a really interesting conversation today, focusing on a demographic that I have seldom focused on the show, which is postdocs and postdocs to be also, right? And I really find it interesting to give them some part of the focus of the show, some time on the spotlight, and I'm really eager to bring to them, to people who are considering looking for a postdoc, because it is looking for a job, right?
Yeah,
Although
absolutely.
it's particular, it's still looking for what's after the PhD. And I think your approach and your that kind of motto or phrase that you use about being field ready, I think it's something that can really translate, and I'm really eager to have this conversation with you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. And I think it's really important, even when you're at your PhD stage, to think a little bit about the postdoc stage, or maybe if it's not postdoc, certainly the post PhD stage, because it's the next big frontier. And at least
Mhm.
my experience was I was so focused on doing the PhD that it was almost like falling through a door. If you're pushing on a door and suddenly it opens and you're on the other side and you kind of stumble, because I hadn't really thought about what was going to happen next and
Yes.
how I was going to manage that. So I do think it's important, at least in the months leading up to the end of your PhD, to start
Mhm.
thinking, how do I arrange my life once this is over? Because it will end, even if you don't think so at the time.
Exactly. Once you, especially in that first year, for it's like a life. It's a lifetime. You think it's going to be
Yeah.
something that never ends, but it does end. And it's interesting because I'm preparing. I'm preparing a keynote presentation, but also to maybe write something. And that's exactly one of the things I want to focus on, which is, yes, it's going to be kind of a bubble. You're going to be in this safe space in different aspects for this much amount of time, but outside of that bubble, time goes on, and there's
Yeah.
there's someone waiting for you to have a conversation later on, for you to come out of the PhD and then say, okay, now how are you going to contribute to my team, to my project, to my company, etc., etc. So yeah, so
Yeah. It's really easy to, because when you're doing the PhD, you eat, sleep, and drink the PhD, or at least a lot of
yes,
people do, particularly towards the end months. And
yes,
not only
exactly.
myself, but a lot of people I've talked to really aren't quite prepared, either how their life is arranged, or even prepared psychologically for
Hmm.
the next step, what happens next. So I
Yeah.
do think, it's really great to give it the time that it's due. It's just as big a consideration as taking on the PhD to begin with.
Hmm. Well, I agree with you totally. I really want to share what you have to share with the Papa PhD audience, but we've kind of started the conversation kind of naturally, which is fine and great. I will still want to kind of let people know who you are,
Sure.
and which is not the way, it's not the pace I usually, or the pacing I usually do things. But hey, we started talking. It's fine. It's perfect. And now I'm going to tell people who is Sara Vero. Sara is a lecturer and researcher in soil and agricultural science. I have learned from your other videos and interviews not to say dirt. It's not dirt.
No, no, not. It's only dirt in the wrong place, and there's very
Exactly.
few wrong places. We can always do with soil in the right place.
There you go. Many areas of study involve outdoor experiments, which bring unique challenges, but often training is focused on laboratory approaches only. Sarah's goal is to help students and early career researchers develop skills that will make them successful in the field and take away the anxiety that many feel around fieldwork. Her book, Fieldwork Ready, covers logistics, safety, experimental design, and essential techniques for field research, and she runs online and in-person workshops and consultations. Many of the skills and approaches learned during field research are transferable to career development, particularly for postdocs and early career researchers. So this is why you're here today on Papa PhD, Sarah, and welcome.
That's right. Thanks very much. Um,
So
yeah,
yeah,
so sorry, go
well,
ahead.
no, I was just gonna ask. I think for me at least the parallel between preparing for what's the term anyway for a field. I want to say expedition. I don't. That's not the term.
Well, in some cases, it is an expedition.
Mhm.
Field work is quite broad. Like it can be everything from a trial, which is like saying a crop growing trial, which is
Mhm.
very similar to the sort of controlled experiments you might do in the laboratory, to kind of investigative expeditions, as you said, where you're going out to an area to either map it or investigate some sort of a
Mhm.
feature, and that's much more loose and sort of flexible. It's less controlled. And fieldwork really is trying to make the outdoors a little bit more controlled, a little bit
Mhm.
more like the lab, so that we can study it in a meaningful way, in a way that we can apply statistics to. As you can imagine,
Mhm.
that's quite challenging.
Yeah, well, it is, and I've known people who've been working, and I don't know the term in English, who've like been sampling diatoms in
Oh,
these
yeah, cool.
very deep, muddy. Anyway, they have these super long like rubber boots that come up to their chest, and they're
Sure, the
like,
waders.
yeah. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean. To be in the muck, but still have like liquid nitrogen and tubes and scales, this and that. I totally understand, and I'm super eager to go into how the process of preparing for an expedition like that translates to the adventure, which is professional life. But before going there, I really want to focus on you, on your profile. I kind of joked about dirt and soil with you in the beginning. You work with soil. I'm sure you've been in these types of difficult environments trying to make science happen. But the question I have for you is, how did you get to this concept of field readiness, and how did the book idea come up, and what's your mission that you've invested, that you've taken on to help people through this concept of field readiness?
Sure, thanks very much. Well, I was not from an agricultural background. I grew up in Dublin, but I was always really passionate about agriculture. I thought it was really exciting. It's quite outdoorsy as a kid. I was out playing in the soil and in the trees and the garden. Like the outdoors was where it was at for me always.
Hmm.
And I studied agricultural science at college, and I was fortunate enough to get a master's and then a PhD opportunity with our national agricultural research agency. And part of that PhD, well, the master's was looking at soil compaction, which is degradation under vehicles or under livestock.
Hmm.
But the PhD was looking at the movement of nitrate and contaminants through the
Yeah.
subsurface. So this, of course, had some lab work and some uh, quite extensive computer modeling. But the most important part of it, the most exciting part of it, was the outdoor field research, where I was applying tracers to the soil and watching their movement through the earth, and seeing where they cropped up in the water. I was taking soil samples back to the laboratory for analysis. I was setting up sensor arrays for monitoring the soil water. And after the PhD, I went on to do a postdoc uh,
Hmm.
at Kansas State University, looking at
Okay.
prairie hydrology, before coming back to Ireland. And when I came back, shifted gears a little bit. I was looking more at water quality, but again, very field based. It was river sampling, designing river monitoring campaigns, things like that. And so the kind of the through line of all of these was an awful lot of outdoor work. And
Hmm.
in my experience, you can get somebody to teach you the scientific technique, and you can learn the scientific principles from a paper or from a manual or a textbook. But that's not what made fieldwork successful. Not only did I have my own fieldwork to draw on, but everyone around me did fieldwork. So you're kind of exposed to it an awful lot in my discipline. And what I saw was that the projects that were most successful, they weren't scientifically better, they were logistically better than the projects
Okay.
that were unsuccessful or the projects that ran into challenges. Really, the research lived and died not on the science, but on the logistics. And I figured that if you were better prepared for the technical side of things, you could better do your scientific work.
Mm-hmm.
People get bogged down in, problems with vehicles, problems in sample management, poor design of project, poor management of their team.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it was really, it was actually, I was at home, I was always saying, I really wish someone should write a book on this. Someone should explain the logistics side. And one of my sisters said, well, you should just do it. And I was kind of hemming and hawing, but she was right. And, a lot of information is there, but if people would just have, I suppose, make the effort to write it down, because that way you can pass it on. So that's
Mm-hmm.
where Fieldwork Ready, the book, came from.
Excellent. And so you did mention before that, like all of us, like me, for example, you kind of thought about post PhD life at the end of the PhD, and
Yeah.
you didn't think about all those logistics beforehand, or at least at the beginning, where there's so much happening. You're getting, you're learning this new culture. You're kind of enchanted with the whole thing, also. Now, if we consider that getting a postdoc position is an expedition per se, because you're going to have to be organized. You're going to have to reach out to different resources and, well, people who want to hire you, of course. But you're going to have to put your ducks in a row to get into the position you want. But you're going to have to also explore different terrains and find, okay, does this one work for me? Does it not? Can you talk a little bit about your experience navigating that, and then can we maybe try and find and determine a parallel between that, the process that you went through, and maybe the ideal process based on this idea of getting ready beforehand, because I
Yeah.
think it's a very important one.
Yeah, I really do think so. And I will say, I kind of said I was unprepared. A colleague of mine who finished her PhD maybe 8 months ahead of me did warn me that I needed to think about the postdoc, and did say it could be quite, the post PhD rather, could be quite a challenging time, which I completely ignored and thought, what is she talking about? I can't wait to
Hmm.
be finished. So it just goes to show that her good advice shouldn't have fallen on such deaf ears. So hopefully, I can provide that similar warning for the next people. Um, I think, what you say is about both finding the right position for you and also kind of exploring and trying on different things post PhD is really, really important. And you might have an idea going forth what might be the best position for you, but you don't really know until you've tried a few things. The thing about a PhD is it's quite a cloistered sort of a life. You're
Hmm.
usually in one or two places. You're not traveling widely. Typically, you're typically mixing with people who are quite similar to you, in that you're focused probably on similar research areas. Your lifestyles become quite similar. Like most PhD lifestyles, they're very, very focused. I think it must be a bit
Hmm.
like, you know being an ancient monk or something, where you're cloistered in, you're focused really, really intensely and becoming very expert. But the thing about becoming very expert is sometimes you become a bit blind, or a bit myopic to things outside that immediate focus. So I
Hmm.
do think you're quite right in saying sometimes you need to try a few things on and really broaden your horizons. And when we say post PhD, often that's a postdoctoral role,
Yeah.
but it could be something else. It could be going into industry. It could be going into time of teaching. It could be taking a break and doing something completely different for a while.
Hmm.
It looks all sorts of different ways for different people. So I think, when we say postdoc in this discussion, it might be better if we think about just post PhD. You
Hmm.
know, um, it's not necessarily going into an academic role. When it comes to applying fieldwork skills to that post PhD time, most people will probably say, the skills and disciplines of resilience, of resourcefulness, of, having a good attitude, a going forth sort of an attitude, are really important. And they're
Mm-hmm.
skills that you learn in fieldwork. And I agree, that's correct. But going back to fieldwork ready, that alone is not enough. You can have a great attitude and no sort of plan or no sort of structure, and
Mm-hmm.
your great attitude alone, while commendable, won't get you where you need to go.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, myself included, need some sort of framework to help them progress. So when it comes to fieldwork, when I'm getting a student ready or getting myself ready to go out on a fieldwork expedition or a fieldwork experiment, there's lots of things I tell them, there's lots of things I think about, but we can really break it down into three. It's your tools, your team, and your time. And
Mm-hmm. I
I
love it.
figure if you can manage those three elements, you're going to be successful in the field. And I also think if you can manage those three elements in relation to your post PhD life, you will be successful in either finding the appropriate postdoc or finding the industry role, finding where you want to go
Mm-hmm.
thereafter. So I think maybe we can drill down into each of those three key elements a little bit, but I do think that they're the keys to success.
Sure, tools, team, and time. I find it really interesting, and especially interesting the team aspect because, like you said, and it's funny. I just mentioned in a conversation not long ago, like the analogy to monks, to being a monk, and this kind of one-track mind thing.
Yeah.
But I in another series of podcasts, the PhD Dojo that I'm doing slowly. I did one about what I call the PhD village and how I think the PhD should not be a solitary endeavor.
I
There's a
totally agree.
solitary part to it, it's your work, it's your thesis, but you would gain by having a village around you, and I talked about mentors, and I talked about peers with whom you do other activities, but I'd like to have, maybe let's drill down on the team aspect because it's not intuitive. What team can I build around my PhD and around my career transition? I'd really love to hear what you have to say more in detail about that.
Yeah, great. Well, when we think about the team in your PhD, only your name is on your PhD thesis. Only my name is on the front of mine. So you're saying, well, is it a team effort? And I'd say certainly it is. There is the PhD student who is the central player in this, but there are a lot of people in supporting and collaborative roles. So you're going to have your PhD advisors or supervisors, depending on what you call them. There, I suppose, your left and your right hand, they're the people who are
Mm-hmm.
right there with you. You're going to have any technical staff who help you either in the lab or in the field. You're going to have people who are simply around you, the other PhDs in your research center or in your university. They might not help you directly in a PhD, although a lot of the time they do. Certainly in my PhD, I helped friends of mine, and some friends of mine truly saved me from
Mm-hmm.
really, really challenging work by myself. They're all part of your team who contribute to the overall goal.
Mm-hmm.
Your wider team are your friends, your family. All of those influence how successful you will be, and they also influence the decisions you might make. So they're really important. Sometimes we don't think about those. We think about the people in the lab, but really your team is everyone around you
Mm-hmm.
who influence you and who are influenced by you. It's kind of symbiotic.
Yeah.
And the other important people in PhD who are on your PhD team, they might only be there for a day or two, but are external external agents. So people who you might hire in for a particular piece of work,
Mm-hmm.
people who might advise you on a particular issue, people who you can reach out to. They might not be there for the day to day, but they do have crucial roles within the overall PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about the post PhD, I kind of broke it down into, well, who might be involved in shaping my next move now that I know I'm finishing up? Who do I need to talk to, or who do I need to consider in relation to what happens next?
Mm-hmm.
So, in no particular order, I would say the first thing is think about your contacts. If you're a PhD student, you've probably gone to conferences, you've met people who you might like to work with in the future, or who you might find who are really inspiring, and you say,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'd like to wind up doing something a little bit like what they do in research I found you can reach out to people. I've never reached out to someone and had a rude response or a rebuff. Most people are quite flattered to be reached out to, even if they're busy. So I would say do so respectfully, of course, of everybody's time. But you can reach out to people for advice, to ask if there are jobs available, to say, here are your skills and your interests, and here's where you're interested in going. So that's really important. I would say if you're a PhD student, and particularly going to conferences, or if you're a member of professional society, I'm a member of the Soil Science Society of America, but they're kind of the biggest soil science society and have a huge impact. And I found the people I met through that had a huge influence and were hugely supportive of me in providing advice and opportunities and recommendations. So what I'd say is if you're a PhD student, if you're going to conferences, if you're meeting people, keep track of names, keep track of emails, and keep in mind, are these people I might like to work for or work with in the future? Um, the other thing you need to think about are who are going to be your referees, because whether you go for a
Yeah.
postdoctoral role or an industry role, you're going to need people who can write a recommendation for you. And
Of course.
really, you don't want someone who's going to do, a lazy job and say, I knew David, he was grand at his job. I knew Sarah, she was a PhD here. Thank you, goodbye. You'd like someone who knows a little bit about your character, about your skills, about your abilities, and who can vouch for you and provide an honest and an accurate reflection of your work. It also is helpful if they're an individual who they don't have to be famous, they don't have to have any particular ranking, but if they are someone who would be in a position to know. In other words, if they're your PhD supervisor or advisor, you would assume that a reference from them is fairly sound. So that's something to consider as well. Basically, what I'm saying is you don't want your mum to write your reference or someone who's obviously biased or obviously close to you,
Of course.
because
Yeah.
that obviously is a little bit weaker.
That
So,
won't fly. Yeah.
yeah, it won't fly. So it's worth thinking about your referees. The other thing you might think about is when you're trying to figure out, well, when you're trying to go for jobs, whether they're postdoctoral roles or whether they're industry roles, interview coaching is really worthwhile. And I know a few people, I've done it informally, or I've gone to workshops and things. And then I know friends of mine who have gone and hired professional interview coaches. You're going to be sitting a lot of interviews. You're probably going to be sitting interviews until you're sick of sitting interviews. I know
It,
I was.
it's going to be a
And
job in itself for a while.
it's a job in itself, and it's really time consuming, and that's something that you're going to have to schedule into. We can talk about time when we get there, but yeah, it's a huge demand. And you'll get better at interviews the more you sit, no doubt. But there are people who make it their whole business training people to be really, really expert in interview. And if you don't want to do, 100 interviews trying to get good at it, it's really worthwhile leaning on that external expertise and getting some advice and guidance on that.
That's a great point. Before I let you move on, this is a great point. Uh, one of the things that maybe I wanted to touch upon, although I know that not everyone has experience or the same experience with it, is mentoring, because part
Mm,
of this training this training for doing interviews, if you in these contacts somehow there's something that clicks and one of these persons you admire in your field becomes a mentor, that interaction with this mentor can be also helpful for you in preparing
totally.
for those conversations. And then there's another method or strategy that's I hear a lot about here in Canada. I've talked with people in France, and it's not as well known or popular there, which is informational interviews. I don't know if it's something
No, I
you've.
haven't come across that.
So the idea is, and again, it can be either through ResearchGate if you're trying to talk with researchers, but it can be on LinkedIn if you're trying to talk with people in industry. Is just reaching out to people on these platforms where they are, they have a profile, so they're kind of, like you said, no one in my case at least has said no, and if they say no, usually it's because they're too busy. But
Yeah,
on these platforms, they're there to share and to talk with someone who has the same profile as you, and say, oh, I really like your journey. I'm really curious at how you got to this position. I'd really like to know whether you needed some training or how. So can we have 15, 20 minutes to chat about that? And now we're back to in person, so you can even go have coffee with these people. But one
Yeah.
of the ways to prepare, apart from the technical aspect of interviewing, but for the meat of what you're going to say in the interview for this specific position, is having these conversations beforehand with people who are in these institutions, who are in these labs, or who are in these companies.
Yeah,
I
that's really, really helpful. Yeah, it's really helpful, and I think that what you say is really interesting. It's so helpful to get to talk to someone informally, because interviews, they're so rigid. Like, they do follow a rubric, and they have very strict criteria normally, and it doesn't always give you the most accurate reflection of what that company or what that university is really like,
mm-hmm,
which can be really valuable, because you might think you're getting into one thing and it could be quite something else.
mm-hmm.
So I think that's really commendable. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So that's a point I wanted to add. Now, about mentorship, have you had experience with external mentors during your
Yeah, I
academic
mean,
journey?
totally. There's definitely people, and I would say again, through the Triple SA, the Soil Science Society of America, there have definitely been individuals who have kind of stepped in and out of my life, but provided a lot of guidance at key
Mm-hmm.
moments. And there's definitely probably a handful of people who I would email. I might not talk to them very regularly, but at crucial turning points would have dropped an email and said, "What do you think about this?" Or, "Can you
Mm-hmm.
give me some advice?" And that's really, really been crucial. And you'll find most professional societies, and I really recommend students to become a member of their professional society during their PhD. A lot of students don't, but everyone I know who's done it has found it to be really, really beneficial. A lot of those will have mentorship programs set up where they
Okay.
will either match you with someone or help you to find a kind of a natural match. And I think having a mentor, they can do something that the interview coaches can't, which is they know you personally to a degree, and they can give you advice that is personal to you. They can understand your character and your motivations and your
Mm-hmm.
goals, and probably give you some guidance. And I think your relationship with your mentor, or if you're the mentor, either, it works both ways, has to be one that's quite trusting, because they
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to tell you things that you might not like, or that you might not particularly want to hear, or tell you, "No, you're wrong," or, "That's
Mm-hmm.
not a good fit," or, something, you think you're doing well at that interview, but actually you're coming across a little arrogant or a little, uncertain. And they can really provide you that real honesty if you have the sort of a mutual trust. That's really, really valuable. So I definitely think mentorship is, if you can find a good fit, is absolutely a huge benefit.
Mhm. I'm gonna let you go on with what the people the team, but I want to
Sure.
just for the people watching or listening, it's a great point that I hadn't I don't think it had been covered yet of the professional societies, and the from what I hear their mandate to the members is to help them in their professional career. So uh, because what I've heard in other conversations is the question of getting a mentor during a PhD is a question of luck.
Mm,
And here you kind of skewing the luck your way by getting
yeah.
into society. So I think it's a great point.
I think, and I've been a member of a few societies throughout my career, but the Triple SA has been the one consistent throughout. But I find that most people I speak to say the same thing about their own
Mm-hmm.
association once they find a good fit, that it really, as you say, it's there to support the individual, because it's made up of the individual. So you all have this commonality, and you'll find that typically it attracts people of a similar mindset or of similar
Mm-hmm.
goals. And quite aside from being able to provide mentorship, when you go for an interview and you're able to say, "I'm a member of such and such society," people are able to connect with that, and they know a little bit about what you might be interested in, or what you might be able to do, or what your background is. It does provide a helpful touchstone. And I think that's quite valuable. There's an awful lot of research institutes now, and there's an awful lot of universities and colleges and research centers, and all of that is great.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a big world, and I don't necessarily know someone in, universities in different parts of America or in different parts of Europe or anywhere else in the world. But if I know that we have this commonality of the society, we can
Mm-hmm.
kind of skip forward a little bit in our
Yeah.
relationship and kind of get down to the discussion and have a little bit of a commonality. I mean, commonalities are crucial in conversation, aren't they?
Oh
You're
yeah.
always trying to make some sort of a connection with someone. The societies help.
Yeah, by the way, commonality, like I was talking about informational interviews, and if already people are on LinkedIn to share, but if you go and you want to talk with someone who is an alumni of the university you're in, or even in the from the program you're from, the chance they're going to be extra happy to talk with you is going
Yeah,
to do be tenfold. And yeah,
yeah,
commonality very important.
yeah, absolutely. I really do think so.
So we're still talking about the team.
Yeah, so the last person I had in mind on the external assistance of your team is additional training. So you come out of your PhD or
Hmm.
you come towards the end of the PhD, you're an expert in laboratory analysis or in field
Hmm.
analysis or in nitrates or in microbiome or whatever else. You're an expert, which is narrow. And it's to be commended, but you also might need additional skills. So you might be lacking some skills which might impede you for going for certain jobs.
Hmm.
I'll give you a great example: driving. Not all jobs require you to have a driving license, but if you're in my field, which is soil science and environmental research, and you're doing field work, you need to have a driver's license, which means you
Hmm.
might need to go and get external assistance from a driving instructor. Or you
Yeah.
might say, well, actually, something, I'm really, really good at soils analysis, but the jobs that I have in mind in the future actually require me to be able to use GIS to be able to do mapping, and I don't have mapping skills. So you might need to do kind of an assessment of your profile and
Hmm.
identify what skills you are missing and go get that extra training. I know it seems like a burden if you're writing up, but
Hmm.
this is part of the next step. So that's your other external assistance.
Super,
And
and it's super important. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. I'm gonna just.
and then the last part of your team, but maybe the most important part of your team, are your family and your friends, your loved ones, who it is in your outside of the lab or outside of the office life who are going to influence your decisions.
Hmm.
Are you going to be taking people with you wherever you go? Are you going to be leaving people? Or is there family dynamics that might be at play there? I can't speak to anyone's personal life. I can't give any recommendations there. Only to say is you need to think about the other people who might be influenced by your decisions, and you also need to talk to them because they probably know you best and
Hmm.
might be able to give you some advice and say, do you know something, this sounds like a good fit for you, or I think that this would be good for you, or this might be bad for you and something to avoid. Talk to those people too. Often, again, with the, you know, narrow field of vision, and it's getting narrower as you're getting closer to
Hmm.
your submission date, you're thinking more and more narrowly every day. Um, it's really important to talk to those outside people because they can give you a little bit of perspective that might otherwise be lacking.
Hmm. Yeah. Whenever you're talking about the tunnel vision getting narrower and narrower, and it's always makes me think. I don't know if you've read or watched the Lord of the Rings. It
Yes, of
makes me think of
course.
Frodo and the Mountain of Doom, and then and oh, now the how am I missing the name of his friend who's
Sam.
Sam, of course, Samwise, and he's the that person for him until the last minute where he drops the ring in there, and but it can at the end when you're like writing and you need to finish and there's corrections, it's kind of like that, and
Yeah.
it's true that you need if you don't want to go it alone completely because it's really hard it can be really hard on you, but yeah, I find it really interesting that you include this aspect, and then
David,
because yeah, go
it's
ahead.
I just want to say it's so funny that you should use that comparison because I think and it's going to show how truly nerdy I am. It runs deep. The bit where Sam says, "I can't carry it, but I can
Mhm.
carry you," and it's a lot like
Yeah.
that. These people are whether your
Yeah.
family or your friends, your loved ones. They're the people carrying you towards the end. You mightn't realize it.
Yeah, it's that moment where you start tearing up.
Yeah, I'll try and
Oh
hold
my
it
god.
in.
Oh
Yeah,
no,
it's
I
very
totally
touching.
understand. It is. No, it's super interesting, and anyway, it's not the first time I use Lord of the Rings as a metaphor for the PhD journey, but But I think that if you do have a team, a fellowship behind you,
Absolutely.
that's helping you even unbeknownst to you. It can help you have a smoother journey. Now, because you talked about logistics, you talked about strategy in the very beginning. I think the next step I'd like to talk about, based on what you said, it's important to build a team,
Hmm.
but building a team requires time, and you
Yes.
can't build a team just in the last 6 months of your or 8 months. Like, if you had listened to your colleague, you would have had 8 months to build a team, which would have been better than probably what happened.
Yeah,
But
pretty much.
what in the part of talking about time, how can we, because I've had these conversations with very young PhD candidates, like first year
Hmm.
is the ones I remember, and there's when you start talking to them about preparing for a multiverse of possibilities versus just being a professor, they kind of glaze over, and there's kind of
Yeah.
a cognitive dissonance, and I haven't found a way, and I'm looking very very hard for a way to have this conversation and have them say, okay, you know what, I'm going to start today doing a little bit of something each week or each month towards that objective, but I haven't found
Yeah.
it yet.
Yeah. I think certainly in field work, time, I think, is the most challenging aspect for most people, because you have your long-term planning. So say, how am I going to do my field trials over the course of these 3 or 4 years? And you
Mm-hmm.
have your immediate time management. How do I manage to get to the site on a given day, take my measurements, set up my equipment, preserve the samples, get back to the lab before they start to degrade? There's really tight time logistics there, nested within this much longer time scale, and it can be quite a challenging psychologically to get your brain around that.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is, when it comes to your post PhD role, I would start with your long term plan. So don't think about initially where you want to be, in the first year post PhD, because you might have to try a few things on, and you might have to go through a few different contracts and a few different roles. But think about, where do you want to be in, say, 5 or 10 years' time? Do you
Mm-hmm.
want to be a research officer running different projects? Do you see yourself in a lecturing role? Do you see yourself going into industry or into private business? You want to have, what is the picture of yourself you want a far way out? Because if you know where you're going, then you can fill in the steps to get there. But if you have
Yeah.
no real long term objective, there can be an awful lot of wandering around,
Mm-hmm.
which is fine. And there's lots of good things about that. It's quite exciting. You learn a lot, you make a lot of friends, things like that. It can also be quite daunting, and maybe you can wind up somewhere you don't necessarily want to be. So I think having a sort of a long term picture is helpful. It's not set in stone. It might
Mm-hmm.
change along the way. You might encounter something or somewhere, someone that you just love, and you're saying, well, this is where I want to be and what I want to do. But you've got to start with a little bit of a plan. So I think having a long term plan is the first thing to consider. The next thing I would say, and this doesn't really apply to industry so much, but it definitely, if you go to further research, postdoctoral research, contract lengths are something that you need to think about. I
Okay.
can't speak for all industries, but certainly in agricultural, environmental science, for both of those, PH or postdoc contracts are typically short. You're looking
Mm-hmm.
between 1 and 3 years. And you're going to have to bear this in mind, that you might take you 1 or 2 or 3 cycles of postdoctoral roles. You might be totally fine with this. You might not. That it might mean that you're moving every couple of years. If you've got a family, or if you've got a property, or if you've got something that's keeping you in one place,
Mm-hmm.
potentially, that's something you're going to have a discussion around. I'm not saying there's no right or wrong here. It's going to be a personal fit and a fit for you and your team. Uh, but I would say that it's something to be aware. If you're going for further research, the length of postdoctoral contracts are frequently an issue in my
Mm-hmm.
experience. So it's just something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and one of the challenges that I find is, especially for very young PhD candidates, is the this concept of considering other possibilities than staying in research.
Yeah.
And I haven't, yeah, like I said, I haven't found a way to push the message through. And but I do think that yes, trying to plan something ahead, even let's say you plan being a professor. If that's the only thing you can imagine for yourself that first year. There's things you can do, and some of them you've mentioned already. Setting up a team, starting to think, okay, who could I network with, but at the same time, you just arrived in a PhD. You probably, wide-eyed and taking it all in, and not ready to do that yet. And I wonder, and we're getting close to the end of the interview, but I wonder what tools you have in mind to help you in that difficult work of imagining something that's 5 years away, 3 years away, depending. I know in Europe often it's 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
Do
it's tricky. I suppose the picture you have of yourself in the future is going to be so specific to the individual. And one of the great things about a PhD is it does give you a little bit of time to
Mm-hmm.
kind of figure that out. And I would say is maybe this takes us full circle to the mentorship again.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you might say, I'd love to be a research officer. Have you ever talked to a research officer? What do they like about their job? What do they not like about their job? What
Mm-hmm.
does their job actually involve versus what you think it involves? Because often they
Mm-hmm.
don't really match up. Similarly with industry, I always think it's really good when universities or colleges have career days for their
Yes,
undergrads, and they'll bring in,
I
you
agree.
know, other universities looking for postdocs or looking for PhD students rather. They'll bring in people from private industry, people from government roles,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll all have their stands and they'll say, well, here's what our jobs we have and what they involve and what they pay and where you'll go. And
Yeah.
in my experience, we don't do that for PhD students. We don't really give them that same guidance. And
Yeah.
maybe we need to. Maybe that's something that would be very helpful. And it's important to say, well, research has a lot of opportunities and here they are. And maybe we
Mm-hmm.
also need to invite industry, and because industry
Yeah.
wants PhD students too, or PhD graduates too. And a lot of my colleagues have gone into industry and been very, very happy and successful in it. But when you're doing research, sometimes all you talk about is research.
Yeah.
So I think, giving people access to people in industries and in different roles to talk in an informal way is very important. And, your advisor is a really important person in your research life, but they are the people who are supervising or advising you day to day. And
Mm-hmm.
relationships are always different, but you may or may not want to have that conversation with them because you might be, embarrassed, or you might feel anxious about, looking good or looking bad in front of
Mm.
them. Um, you might not want them to think your focus is elsewhere. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
having a
Definitely.
mentor or being able to approach someone who's got really no vested interest in you can actually be a great resource.
I agree. And sadly, we're getting really to the end of the interview. But
Sure.
one really great point that you mentioned is this need for us to build bridges between the industry. Well, not even government. There's government
Yeah.
jobs,
Oh,
right?
totally.
But to build platforms of conversation where the research community and these other communities learn to know each other, because I think one
Yeah.
of the challenges we have is that industry wants PhDs, but when you ask them, do they know what a PhD is? Because a PhD can be so many different things from depending on where they come from, what they studied, and
Yeah.
I think I see it happening. More the need So platforms need to be built, and I would say by universities, but and by PhD programs to create these platforms of conversation, these spaces of conversation, and these spaces of getting to know each other.
Yeah.
Industry to know PhDs and PhDs to know industry. Of course, if you can do an internship during a PhD, wow,
Yeah.
that's the
Very
best
helpful.
case scenario.
Totally. I
But
totally
but
agree.
I think there needs to be a wider opening up of the two compartments to each other and to becoming friends and to
Yeah.
cohabitate this space,
I
this
completely
economic space.
agree.
Yeah.
And I think the universities and colleges do a very good job in industry and government jobs as relates to their undergrad. Where I saw it in a positive way when I was a PhD student is my society, the Triple SA. They did
Hmm.
invite industry people to come to our events,
Okay.
our annual meetings, but if you don't make the annual meeting, or if you're an international
You missed it.
student, and you might miss out on that. But I think the frameworks are there, both in the societies and in the universities, to further make post PhD um, post PhD pathways a little bit more illuminated
Mm-hmm.
in terms of outside jobs. I do think the frameworks are there, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
we just need to build on them. Maybe they just haven't been fully tapped into yet.
Yeah, I think it's happening, but it's not a quick process, and because it's also it's not a homogeneous problem, right? And,
Totally.
yeah.
And
Uh,
it goes both ways. Coming out of the PhD, I had a really good idea of what was involved in research. I'd had a really good exposure to research, and I kind of knew what was ahead of me. But I did look at industry jobs too, and to be
okay.
quite frank, I really didn't know what was involved in any of them. I
Mm-hmm.
knew an awful lot about or I thought I knew an awful lot about research. Now I don't know, but I knew very little about industry, and I do think I could have been more judicious and probably more successful in industry
Mm-hmm.
jobs if I'd chosen to go down that pathway, if I'd known a little bit more about them when I was coming out, when I was graduating.
Mm. Well, Sarah, I'm super happy that you shared all of this knowledge. I don't think we covered everything we had to, but sadly we we're almost at an hour, and
Of
it's a little
course.
bit above than usual. People who are watching on YouTube now see your contacts down here,
Wonderful.
but for those who are listening on the podcast, can you share where is the best place, the best platform to find you? Maybe your Twitter handle also.
Yes. So I have a website. It's fieldwork-ready.com, because fieldworkready.com without a hyphen was taken. Uh, you can find me at Twitter at fieldworkready, or you can email me at fieldworkready@gmail.com.
Mhm.
I do run ongoing online workshops and in-person workshops as well, but usually
Perfect.
online is pretty good for international people, because I have people at any workshop. I have people from Ireland, people from Switzerland. I had someone from Israel recently,
Oh wow.
all over America. So it's nice to, the online thing has some advantages in that you can get a really broad cross section of people
Hmm.
all coming together. So the next event will be on the 22nd of June. So if people go
Perfect.
to my website or go to my Twitter, all the details about that will be there. Of course,
Perfect.
it's fieldwork focused, but I do think there's going to be other events later on that are maybe a little similar to this discussion, have a bit of a more broader application.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure that some of the listeners of the show are postdocs, are PhDs, and will gain from joining you on your training. Thanks for sharing the dates. I was going to ask you. What I'll do is I'll share those links in the notes page of the episode
Thank you.
when it when it becomes a podcast, which is going to be soon. Um, Sarah, thank you so much. It was really great having this more academia focused point of view, even though things were applicable to non-academic job, professional journeys. Thanks for your time. Thanks for having been on Papa PhD. I think this is going to help a lot of people potentially, and I commend you for the work you do, and I really enjoyed spending this almost hour chatting with you about this. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, David. It was a real pleasure. I really enjoyed that.